Good afternoon, good morning, depending on where you're watching us from. It is definitely a great day. I love Mondays because of Maker Monday. And today I'm particularly excited because I have guest Devon Calvert. And I call Devon one of my home peeps because he's from Milton, Wisconsin. Well, he teaches in Milton, Wisconsin. And so when the world is not in a pandemic, he often can participate in things close by and is definitely absolute trusted advisor and consultant. And so today he has a packed hour of information for you. It's hip to be contemporary. It is all about artists and elementary art and how he makes it work. And so Devon, thank you so much for being here. You are so good at what you do, and I'm grateful that you're willing to share it with everybody.
Thanks, Kris.
I didn't give you a true proper introduction. There's so much more to who you are and what you do. You're an artist, you're the Wisconsin Art Ed Association president, and you are such a networker. So that's a little bit better, but I just want you to take over and show this awesome stuff that you're doing in the art room.
Thanks, Kris. I'm really excited to be here. I wish I had more time. I could probably talk for an entire hour and a half, 2 hours if I had the chance. Make sure you guys can see me.
Yep, so far so good.
Awesome. Yeah, so I have lots to get through, so I'm going to talk kind of fast. I'm a pretty quick talker to begin with. But there's so many things I want to show you guys, so I'm going to talk pretty quickly. And whatever I don't get through, you can always reach out to me, and I can talk you through whatever I missed. Here is my contact information.
I actually added a handout with the link to this PowerPoint. So if Devon doesn't get through the whole thing, you'll get the full PowerPoint. There's also a link to a handout he created, which is fantastic, and then all of Devon's information. And so if you have questions during, go ahead and type them into the question box, and I will help facilitate throughout, and then we'll save a little bit of time as best we can for the end. And you can always type a question into the survey, or if you would like to just respond to the email that you'll get as a follow-up. Okay, that's all. I will interrupt for now, and you go right ahead.
Thanks, Kris. As you said, my PowerPoint is included on this, and all of these are hyperlinked, so you can just click on them and they'll take you right to my different social media platforms. I highly recommend the YouTube one because I've made a demo video for the last 5 or 6 years of just about every project I've ever taught. So if you ever wanted to see actually how I break down these projects and teach them, you are more than welcome to show those to your students as well. So the YouTube, there's several hundred videos on there for you to check out. So a lot of times the people ask me, why did I decide to switch to a contemporary based curriculum? And particularly with my 3rd grade students, I started this about 5 years ago. I do sprinkle in contemporary artists with my kindergartners, 1st graders, and 2nd graders, but once they get to 3rd grade, I do a completely contemporary curriculum. And I only teach K3. I don't teach 4th and 5th grade at the elementary level, just K3. But part of the reason I do this is because I really want students to have an awareness and appreciation for current artists and things that are happening right now. Okay, these artists are dealing with things that are relevant to them. They're dealing with topics that are happening right now. They're not talking about things that happened several hundred years ago. And I find that when I talk about things that matter, that are occurring daily, that this really increases my student engagement and their buy-in on those projects. They're more interested, they listen better. I don't have as many redirections, which is great. Who doesn't want more redirections? So my students, I've actually noticed like a shift in their behaviors when we talk about artists that are more relevant to them. Not only does it help keep my students up to date on what's happening in the art world, it helps keep me up to date on my content knowledge. I feel like once we get done with college and taking art history classes, we don't always push ourselves to learn more about art history. So when I'm dealing with contemporary artists, I have to actively seek out new artists to learn about. And it kind of helps me keep up to date with kind of the cutting edge artists and kind of who's hot in the art world. Also, typically when we talk about art history, we think of dweebs, is what I call them, and they're called dead white European men. Your Van Goghs, your Picassos. They're not very diverse. Okay, now most of my student population is white, but many of us don't have a lot of white students. We teach in a more diverse population, and when we look at contemporary artists, we start to see the rise of these diverse artists who oftentimes haven't been represented in the past, whether they're females or Asian artists or African artists or Black artists, excuse me. It really opens it up so students who might not look like me, that they can then see themselves represented as artists as well. These artists are also really using some new and innovative mediums. We see multimedia, we're beginning to see video and sound, we're seeing installations. There are artists out there who even use gunpowder. So they're really pushing materials to new limits, things that we haven't seen in the past with necessarily more traditional artists. Today, artists are also collaborating with each other a lot more. And I noticed too that a lot of the times when I taught, in the past, when I taught a lot of these dead white European men, the first question students would ask me is, when did this person die? So by teaching as contemporary artists, I don't have that question anymore. And I feel like a lot of times students thought that being an artist was something of the past, that they couldn't grow up to be an artist. That wasn't a thing anymore because they're only learning about people who aren't alive anymore. So now that I'm teaching them about these contemporary artists, that's a potential career that they can see themselves in. They know that there are people who still do this today. And last but not least, it gives the students the chance to actually interact with the artist. So oftentimes I'll reach out to these artists on social media, and a lot of times they'll take the time to actually respond back, which the students love. Sometimes it's just a simple emoji. Other times they'll actually take us a couple minutes to write a paragraph or two back to the students thanking them. Here on the right is actually a video with me, and this is an artist named Janet Eckelman. She's actually the first contemporary artist that I ever taught, and she was one of the keynote speakers back at the NAEA convention a couple years ago. So I actually got to meet her after her presentation, and I showed her some examples of my student work, and she actually recorded like a quick 10-second clip thanking and congratulating my students.
Hi, Harmony and Consolidated. You did a beautiful, beautiful artwork in your room, and I wish I could lie underneath it and look up at it.
And hopefully we'll have some time to see the work that was inspired by her later on. But my kids like flipped their lid when they found out that she had made a video for them. Now, another one of the questions I get is, where do I find these artists? Oftentimes we didn't have a contemporary art history class in college. So I did hyperlink in a few websites that are really good. And even if you're not interested in teaching contemporary art, I recommend following these on social media, just because a lot of the artists they're showing are cool. I mean, I enjoy looking at them myself, even if I don't have the opportunity to teach about them. But I would say Colossal and the Jealous Curator, those are probably my top two that I really enjoy. A lot of really good artists on there. I did link my Pinterest board as well, where I have tons of contemporary artists that I'm inspired by. And then you can always check out museums and gallery websites too. A lot of times they'll have a contemporary exhibit or section to their websites. There are also a lot of really great Instagram art educators out there. I did list them. I highly suggest checking them out. You'll notice a lot of Don Massey lessons throughout this too. He's like the king of teaching contemporary art to the elementary age students. So I did try and give credit anytime I use one of his projects, and we'll see a couple of his throughout my presentation. And then there are a few others here as well. But I highly suggest checking them out online. They've got a lot of really fabulous ideas. So one way to pull in contemporary artists is talking about things that are actually happening in the news. A great example of that was a few years ago when Notre Dame caught fire. So my students, we had a lengthy conversation about Gothic architecture and kind of how that fire had started. And then we added those elements to a marker and charcoal drawing. And then I also talked to them about radial symmetry, and we used a CD to add that rose window, which we typically see in Gothic cathedrals. So that was a great way to kind of talk about something huge that had just happened in the news. Then as another little tie-in, I actually took this photo online of the Notre Dame, and I actually photoshopped out the roof of it. and we placed ourselves in the role of an architect. And if they could redesign the roof of Notre Dame, what would they want it to look like? So I had some more traditional approaches where this student said that they would use stained glass to recreate the roof. This student thought it'd be cool if it was a water slide, that you start up at the tippy top and you kind of slide your way down to the bottom of the roof. So there's some really fun, different approaches to how they would solve the problem of creating a new roof. Another thing that's kind of been in the news over the past few years is this conflict that's kind of happening between two artists, and their name is Stuart Semple and Anish Kapoor. Now, Anish Kapoor is a really famous artist. He's most well known for the Bean, or Cloud Gate as it's actually called. Now, Anish, he was working with a science lab, and they created this new paint called Banta Black. And it's actually the blackest substance that we know to date. It absorbs like 99.9% of light. So when you coat something in it, it literally doesn't reflect any light. So it looks like a black hole. So we see this picture in the bottom left. Okay, here's the sculpture that they painted over, and how it almost looks like it's just been photoshopped out. It's so black and doesn't reflect any light that your eyes can't actually comprehend what you're seeing. Now, what made so many artists mad was that when Anish Kapoor partnered with these scientists, he actually bought the rights to this Banta Black. So he is the only artist in the entire world that can use this colored black. Now, this obviously upset a lot of artists. So a lot of people reached out to this British artist named Stuart Semple, and he's been making his own paints for like over a decade now. So what he decided to do is he made this pink called the Pinkest Pink, which is up in the top left. And actually that pink is so pink that the pixels on your computer can't accurately portray how pink it actually is. So the funny thing with Stuart Semple is that when you go to purchase this paint, or any of his paint on his website now, you actually have to sign a waiver saying that you are not Anish Kapoor. So literally anybody in the world can buy his paints except Anish Kapoor. And that was kind of his way of getting back at Anish for having these rights to this Banta Black. And it's gone back and forth over the years. You should definitely check it out. They're always kind of making little remarks at each other. So my students use that as inspiration for this Cassie Stevens project, where we practice mixing as many colors as they could. Once they found a color that they really liked, then we used paper mache and celluclay to make a paint tube, and then they got to apply that color that they really liked and came up with a name for their paint as well. So here we see Izzy. She made Izzy's Beach Peach. So it was pretty cool to kind of let the students explore with color, and then to come up with the name of their own paint tube if they could actually make one. And Stuart Semple was really great about reaching back to my students too, and actually offered to ship us some paints. Another thing that happens every other year is this Brussels flower carpet. So as I said, it's biennial. And what they do is in the middle of Brussels, they take their national flower, which is the begonia, and create these really cool symmetrical geometric designs. And a lot of times their designs are inspired by things around the world, like they might be honoring their partnership with Japan or something else. A lot of times their patterns are reminiscent of who they're honoring. So my students use this as inspiration to then create a symmetrical work of art using warm colored sheets of paper. We work on layering and geometric shapes, and then we finish it off with some more fine details using some crayons. So that's kind of a nice way to work in symmetry. And as I said, that happens every other year. It's actually supposed to happen this year, but obviously the event was canceled due to COVID. Another way that I introduce a lot of artists, contemporary artists, to my students is this Art Madness tournament that I do. And I do this every March. It lines up with March Madness. And what I do is each year I typically have 6 artists that I display in my classroom over the tables. So like in a lot of classrooms, they'll have like a red table or an orange table. Well, I'll name these artists after artists, or these tables after artists instead. And then my students are like aware of their work. They get to see it hanging up all year round. Well, we don't always get the chance to, sorry about that. I'm in the middle of school right now. A lot of times we don't get the chance to actually make projects inspired by these artists. So as a way to introduce them to their work, we set up a bracket. And then over time, we vote on which artists we like the best. We debate why we like them, things that they like about the artist, things that they don't like. And we do this over 2 class periods without making any art. Sounds kind of crazy, but the kids love it, even though they're not actually making anything, until we actually crown a champion for that tournament. And I'll do this with each class. So it's really great to see how among my 4 different 3rd grade classes, how their opinions can really vary, how a lot of times they'll each have a different victor by the time we reach the end of the tournament. And usually I'll do this with 10 artists. So I'll take 6 of my table artists that I use, and then I'll add 4 more to that theme, because usually my tables are based on a theme. Like this year I did contemporary female artists. So they had 10 contemporary female artists that they voted upon. And if you want to know more about it, I do have a hyperlinked article right up here. This goes back to the art class curator. She asked me to write an article for it, which is a great plug, because I hear that Nasco just partnered with Cindy Ingram over at the art class curator. So I highly recommend checking that out. I even think it gave you 10 images to use, as well as information about each of the artists for you to introduce to your classrooms. School-wide collabs are a great opportunity too to bring in contemporary artists. This is a quilter named Corinne Sovey. I really enjoyed this piece off to the left and how she had that gradual change or gradation with her colors. She's also a textile artist too, so each one of the little swatches on her quilt, she actually designs that pattern. And a lot of times I'll start the beginning of each year with a collaborative project that I'll do from K all the way up to 3rd grade. And quilts are really a great one because they're so like segmented and geometric that a lot of times they lend themselves to kind of going together. And then I'll gradually shift the colors too as my students work. So you can see I get this kind of full rainbow effect across the quilt. Here's another artist named Jason Woodside. He does a bunch of big murals. He's really famous for this one down in Nashville that me and my wife got to see on our honeymoon. So then we use that as inspiration too for this large collaborative piece. A lot of times with his work, we see kind of these diagonal patterned lines that kind of intersect. So I had my students each pick a direction, and then we kind of worked our way across the mural with all these intersecting diagonals and shifts in color. You know, as I said, 3rd grade is kind of my baby. They're the ones that I love using all the contemporary art with. My personal style of teaching is discipline-based art education. So a lot of times I introduce an artist, we draw inspiration from them, we kind of talk about their bio, the aesthetics of their work. I know that DBAE is not for everybody. There are choice-based art teachers out there. There are tab-based teachers out there. So I'm just here to show you how I do it. You guys can adapt these however you would like. One artist that I like to teach, his name is 1010. He is an anonymous street artist from Europe, and he makes these almost like portals into walls. A lot of times he'll work with analogous colors. This one doesn't show the analogous colors, but a lot of his work does. He also does a really great job using value, and how he shifts that value really creates a sense of space in his work. Like we could walk right into that wall. Sometimes he works organically, other times he works very geometrically. So I let my students choose their design. We start with that black shape. So the student used the black triangle, and then we lay out shifting of colors from one color to the next to the next. So this student started with a dark red and kind of shifted their way through a variety of different oranges. Some students only get shifted through a couple, other ones will go through the entire rainbow. So it's pretty cool to see kind of their approach to that, whether they want to work geometrically or organically. We also glue pieces of cardboard underneath each one of these layers too. So these are 3-dimensional. They actually do kind of pop up off of the artwork a bit. One that I'm going to do coming up too, I'm going to do a digital version of it. I've not done this yet with my students, but using the app Teosui Sketches School, I listed that down at the bottom. I believe it's a free app, not 100% sure on that, but they can then create a gradient based design too by using the fill bucket on that, and then slowly shifting the values and colors. They can kind of create that same kind of portal effect. Lena Ayers Victor is probably one of my very favorite artists. She is over in Britain, I believe, and she works with a really limited color palette. She uses a very specific color blue, 24 karat gold, which my students think is awesome because it's actual gold, and then she'll use black. And what I like about her work is that it looks really complex, but it's really just simple lines and shapes that have been overlapped to create this kind of complex looking composition. So that's really what I stress with my students. I give them all rulers, and then I give them a variety of different circles and really stress how can you overlap and intersect these lines and shapes to make something really simple look really complex. And then they get to choose their background color. This student chose blue, but they can choose whatever color they want. And then they get to use black and gray on their design too. Using gold paint is like using actual gold in the elementary classroom. Like they freak out when we get that out. They're so excited to use gold paint. Lena also will photograph herself in front of her painting. So a lot of times she'll make this painting and then she'll decorate her body in that same style too, where she'll put like gold jewelry on and paint parts of her body. And then she'll photograph herself in front of it too. So it's not only a painting, but then she has like this photographic element to her work as well. Maya Hayuk is a muralist out of Brooklyn, and she has this philosophy that each day it seems like the world gets a little darker and darker. So she needs to combat that with making her artwork brighter and brighter. She does a really great job of working from kind of desaturated tints up to these more saturated bright colors. And that really creates a great sense of space in her work. She also typically has a lot of symmetry. And now I cut off kind of the right side of her mural, but it's very symmetrical. Her paints are oftentimes really watered down too. So we see that they drip, they kind of become translucent. So you can start to see all those layers that she builds up. I use this as a simple way to introduce symmetry to my third graders. They already know it for the most part at this point. They've learned about it in first grade and second grade, but kind of a way to build up to some more advanced symmetry projects in third grade, where we just make simple V shapes and we start off with some tinted colored papers and we work our way up to more saturated, focusing on shifting the V's, either going up or going down, leaving gaps, and it kind of creates like this intricate woven pattern just by repeating that V shape over and over. She also does these different kinds of murals. These ones obviously aren't symmetrical, but very geometric. This is a great adaptation that I saw Don Massey do. I mentioned him earlier as a great educator to follow. These were done using the app called Assembly. Now, Assembly used to be a completely free app. Now it takes a subscription. However, I believe that you can download it and it gives you 2 free projects for your students to make before you have to purchase it. And I believe if you make a project and then when you're done with it, if you delete it, I think it actually gives you one of those projects back. So as long as you make something and then delete it, I think you can continue to use the app. But my students, we took a picture of one of the walls of the school, and then I blocked out a big chunk of it. So here we see that black background. And then I asked them to make a symmetrical geometric mural inspired by her. So this is a really cool way to do almost like a augmented reality, where they're taking a picture of a place they know, like our school, and creating a digital mural that they wish could go on top of that. Kris Zydeck is one that my students just finished up. We use that Assembly app again, and we use concentric shapes, working on shifting the tints and shades of it. So the value, so we talked a little bit about value. And we kind of went back to that whole Lena Ayers Victor idea again, using really simple shapes, but how when we overlap them, intersect them, it can make our artwork look more complex. So after they created their lines and shapes in the Assembly app, my school uses Seesaw as a way to interact with the students online. So then we uploaded these into Seesaw and used the simple pen tool to add some detailed patterns to each one of their shapes. So they just finished these up, and Kris was really great about reaching out to my students too. He was super pumped and excited that my kids were learning about him, and he posted it out on his Instagram and stuff. So they really enjoyed seeing that. Rowena Meadows, back when lockdown started, I really wanted to find a way for my students to make art that didn't actually require any art supplies, because I know that there's discrepancies between families' socioeconomic statuses. So I really wanted to try to make art that didn't require markers and pencils and paper and things like that. So Rowena is an Australian-based photographer, if I remember correctly. And when lockdown started, she began to do these monochromatic photographs with her family, and they would put on these crazy outfits. They'd find these random objects. I just loved how fun and playful they were. So I put that one out there for my students, kindergarten to third grade. And what I wasn't expecting was how many families got involved with it. I thought it would just be the students getting a bunch of stuff. But a lot of families like turn this into like a whole family event. So I thought this was a really awesome example. There were so many good ones. It was really hard to pick just one. But I got a lot of great feedback from the parents saying how much fun they had doing this with their artists. And then another example of another one of my lockdown projects was AWOL rizku, kind of similar to Kahindi, where oftentimes he replaces somebody from a master's painting that was white with somebody who's black. However, Kahindi Wiley is a painter, AWOL rizku is a photographer. So a lot of times he'll take old paintings and then he'll photograph a contemporary African-American in their place, and then he'll put his own little twist on it. So instead of having the diamond earring, here we see a bamboo heart-shaped earring instead. So I introduced him to my students and then asked them to find artwork, and then I wanted them to try and recreate that using themselves. I thought this little artist did an awesome job at it, getting the fabric right. And here you can see she's holding her tablet instead of this big board that the actual painting has. Her mom even added a filter to it to kind of give it that look. So I thought this was a really great example of that without the kids actually having to use any art supplies. Nayspoon is another street artist that my students just got done learning about. She is from Poland, and she's really inspired by lace. And she'll collect lace from like the places she goes, because not all lace is the same. It's really varies depending on where you go to. And then she'll make these huge murals inspired by that lace. So my students use an app called Drawings, which is free, I believe. And I believe that they have a web version of it too, so you can actually do it on your computer. And Drawings is a really great way to make radial symmetry. And you can change the thickness of lines, so you can get these really detailed, like overlapping designs. Then we use an app called Pixlr, which I believe is also free. And Pixlr has a double exposure feature. So we took one of our school walls again, like we did with the previous mural that we made. And we used the double exposure then to take our radial murals or radial designs and then put them on top of that wall. So it kind of has that lace-like look to it. And I really stressed, thinking about composition, overlapping them, working with not just small brush strokes, but also large brush strokes too, so they get kind of that variety. Richard Serra is one that my students are working on right now, actually. Now, he is an artist who, throughout college, he worked in a steel mill, and that really inspired his use of using steel in his work. So he makes these huge steel walls. And what I like about them is that over time they change, they begin to rust, they begin to patina, and the colors and texture change on them. And what he's really doing is he's playing with your sense of space. Now, throughout art, typically I stress space as something that's close or far away from us. But this time I kind of pitch it as your personal space. How would it feel if you're walking through his sculpture? Because some narrows get really narrow. How would that make you feel? Would you feel claustrophobic? How would it feel if you walk into a larger area? A lot of times too, his walls actually tip in and out. So you might be walking through an area that kind of tips over you or tips outward. How does that affect your personal space and your bubble and your emotions as you interact throughout his sculptures? And what I like too is that if you're a bird flying over these, they're really just line designs. So my students decide on a line design and they can choose organic or geometric. And then they use brown strips of paper and cut these little tabs into it. So they actually create these little three-dimensional walls that they can then recreate their line designs on. And we've actually taken marbles after this and turned these into like little marble mazes. They think that's pretty cool too, how they can tip their papers and use those little walls that they create to guide them. Levon, this is a little bit more advanced symmetry that I do, just a simple symmetrical bug project. But Levon is a British photographer who really likes to focus on bugs. So he'll go to like a local college and use their bug collections. But when he photographs a bug, this image that we see to the left, that's made up of like 9,000 photographs that he stitches together. So he'll like zoom in on a little itty bitty spot and photograph it, and then he'll change the lighting and rotate the camera just a hair. Like, I want to say he rotates the camera like a tenth of a hair or something like that. And he'll take photograph after photograph after photograph of these highly detailed little minuscule spots. And then he used a program to stitch them all back together. And it creates like these super detailed photographs of bugs that he then prints out on like 10-foot long photographs. Sarah Krajewski, love her to death. I went to college with her, and she's a really great art educator, actually. But on top of being an art educator, she's also a practicing artist, like many of us are. And I thought it'd be really cool if my students learned about not just an artist, but somebody like you and I that actually make art on the side. So we actually made collagraphs, so a form of printing, and then they made a whole bunch of those prints, and we kind of focus on her shapes, how we see a lot of times like overlapping shapes. We see a mixture of geometric as well as some more organic shapes. We printed a whole bunch of times, and then once all their prints were dry and they had this repeated image over and over, they worked with oil pastels then to color in parts of their prints. And Sarah was really great. She was great about responding to my students. I actually sent this on to Youth Art Month, where it ended up going to our state capitol. And my artist actually got to then go and meet Sarah, because Sarah was there with her students as well. So it was really amazing that my student actually had the opportunity to meet the artist that her work was inspired by, and actually went to the state capitol. So I thought that was a really awesome opportunity with Sarah. Karina Ibatova, she is a Russian watercolor artist, and she typically works with gems and minerals. Now in Wisconsin, at least in my district, there's a heavy focus on learning about minerals and how they're formed. A lot of times they go to the Cave of the Mounds in the spring. So this kind of ties into their science curriculum a little bit. We take a look at like how are gems formed. Notice how a lot of times they're faceted, and that comes down to their molecular composition, I guess you could say. And then students have the choice of either redrawing a cut gem like we see here, or more of a raw mineral like we see off to the left. And then I introduce them to a variety of watercolor techniques like blending, like wet on wet, using the salt technique. So they do about half of their gem using watercolor. And then we go ahead and use tempera paints with some glitter medium, which they love using glitter medium too. They use tempera paints and then create a variety of tints and shades using one color to fill in the other parts of it. So it kind of creates these shadows and highlights on their gemstone. And that tied into Olafur Eliason one year. My first year, I had them also paint value strips so I could see their understanding of value and how to make tints lighter and how to make shades darker. Well, then I had hundreds of these little tints and shade strips I didn't want to just throw away. So we actually organized them and glued them all together. And then I attached it to a hula hoop and created this chandelier that hung from our ceiling. And that was based on Olafur Eliason, who has this installation piece on top of a art museum over in like Sweden or Norway, somewhere in one of those Scandinavian countries. His work oftentimes deals a lot with light and color and how that can affect your perception. He has a really amazing episode on the art of design on Netflix. I highly recommend checking out. It's like an hour long, but he's a genius. I love him. But a lot of his work kind of deals with how colors and the way they can change the light around you can really affect your emotions as you interact with his artwork. Julie Moretz is another one of my favorites. She works a lot with layering blueprints and charts and photographs of architecture to the point that it really becomes this abstracted design. She also has a great sense of depth too in her work, kind of the way she shifts from some smaller shapes to some larger shapes. So what I did was we took a sheet protector that typically, you slide a white sheet of paper in there and then it can go in a binder. Well, what we did was I printed off a bunch of different 3D Google Maps, and then students could choose the city that they wanted to work on. And they slid that in, and they would pick and choose little spots on their maps to fill in with Sharpies. And then the next day they flipped their sheet protector over and put a new map in, and they worked from the back side. And then we finished it off with a actual transparency, picking and choosing parts of it. And then once they slid that transparency into their sheet protector, what happened was that they ended up with 3 layered maps and kind of creating this really abstracted, complex looking work of art inspired by 3 different maps from around the world. And then we also did a variation of that using our iPads since we've been digital the last couple months. They did this with the Teosui Sketches School, where they would import a map, work on top of it, and then save it. And then after 2 or 3 weeks, I had them use the double exposure feature in Pixlr and layer those on top of each other. So we get some overlapping and some different sizes of shapes. Caroline South is another great one if you're virtual. Simple color wheel is what I taught. And then I really focus on those tertiary colors too. I just told them to find things around their house to work with. Caroline South does the same thing. She'll collect things out on the streets or around her house and then photograph them in these really interesting compositions. And a lot of times they feature some kind of a gradient. So she was a nice little tie-in. And another one of those examples where they didn't really need any art supplies to actually do this. Doho So, his work is amazing if you can ever see it in person. I actually started to introduce my students to his work, and then he actually had a show in Madison, Wisconsin, which is like 40 minutes from me. So while I was teaching him, I actually got to go and see his work and see him give an artist talk, which was really mind-blowing to see and hear him. He also has a really great Art 21 episode. But his work deals with displacement and coming from South Korea and how he's had to change locations over time. And he really wished that he could take his home from South Korea, pack it up in a suitcase, and take it with him to America. So that's exactly what he did. He literally made a 2-scale replica of his house in South Korea out of like really fine silk or mesh. And he literally put it in a suitcase and took it across the ocean to America, where he could then recreate it. And his work is super detailed. Like when you look at his work, the doors have doorbells on them, they have knobs on them, they have little screws on them, and it's all made out of like a wire, or it's all made out of like this wired system with mesh sewn onto it. It's really amazing. And then because it's like this meshy silk, they're translucent too, so you can start to see all the different layers. But his like attention to detail is amazing. Like you look at the toilet, and because it's see-through, you can actually see the piping inside the toilet that he's created. He also did a really cool work where he covered his entire apartment with like a giant vinyl sticker, and then he did a texture rubbing of the entire apartment and then removed it. So when he puts this up on like a museum wall, essentially you're seeing like a blueprint of what his house looked like based on this rubbing that he did. It's really, really cool to see in person. So my students use burlap, and we drew out what we want our dream homes to look like. And then we actually did some stitching onto burlap to create our dream homes. And then as a supplement, we also made blueprints on blue construction paper with a white colored pencil, so they could kind of draw out what they wanted the inside of that house to look like as well. Jeff Koons, you can love him or hate him. I know a lot of people are not fond of his work. I did have the opportunity to see him at NEA a couple of years ago and hear him talk about his work. The first year that I taught about him, we actually made paper mache balloon animals. Sounded super cool at the time, and the kids loved it. They talked about it for years, but holy cow, was it a headache, because I had to go in and blow up these balloons ahead of time. And a lot of times students would get halfway paper mache and their balloon would pop, and then they'd have to do the other half on a different balloon, and then we'd have to do surgery and put them together. It was nuts, but they turned out pretty cool. And then we also do glue drawings of them, and I talk a lot about form and how we can use highlights and shadows to make that that balloon animal look 3-dimensional, even though it's technically 2D. And Jeff Koons, he kind of plays with this idea of things being immortal. So when we think about something having air, it has life. You know, we breathe in, we have life. But when we cease breathing, you know, we die, kind of like a balloon. When it has air in it, it takes on a sense of life. But when it runs out of air, you know, it's just a limp balloon then. So by taking these things made out of typically balloons and making them out of metal, they never deflate. They take on this sense of being immortal. So kind of cool to see his work. Hamish Fulton, so this is another one I got from Don Massey, a great one to do with your students on their iPads. This was done using the Assembly app, and the reason we did it with Assembly was because Assembly allows you to put text, and it also allows you to turn the text, make it bigger and smaller, change fonts, which were all things that I stressed throughout this project is how can you use text to influence the viewer. So Hamish Fulton's actually a walking artist. Sounds kind of odd, but he literally makes his artwork inspired by the walks he goes on, whether it's photographs or poetry or a painting. A lot of times he will superimpose text, poetry on top of his photographs that he takes. So I asked the students to do the same thing, was to go around their house or a picture that they've taken on a vacation, and then think about the emotions that they had, the things that they smelled, the things that they heard, what they saw, and come up with a way to convey those things using text on top of their photographs. This student said, not scared, jumping on rocks, parents worried. And I had some pretty funny ones. I liked that a lot of students were pretty lighthearted with it too. This is one from Nick Hahn. You might know her as Minnie Matisse. But what she had students do was they could either draw a drawing of a person and then cut out the clothing, or they could even just take a magazine page and cut out the head of something or cut out the clothing of something, and then go around your house or around your neighborhood and hold it up against different things and photograph it, and try and find some different textures and materials that would look cool as like clothing. So this is a great way to introduce like clothing design to your students. A lot of times students wouldn't ever think about that as being an arts related career. And it was pretty fun to see how some students, took it very seriously. They drew out their design or their person, then held it up in front of things. And others would take like Big Bird out of a magazine, cut out his body, and then hold up Big Bird's head in front of things and how his body would change then. So it's pretty cool to see how creative some of the students got with these designs. And we learned about a Instagram artist named Shamik Al-Bloui. I think that's how you pronounce it. I can't quite remember, but kind of works with that same concept about how he does these fashion designs and then goes around cities and uses architecture to inspire those. Chuck Close, I'm sure many of you are famous or aware of his work. But a lot of times he works either hyper realistically or he'll break down artworks into this gridded pattern and then almost make like these little designs within each square. He has, oh man, I'm going to forget the name of it right now. But basically, he has facial blindness. There's a fancy word for it, but he can't recognize people just by looking at their faces. So by breaking them down into these gridded patterns and really studying them, it's a way for him to help recognize people. So my students did the same thing. We gridded out this sheet of paper. A lot of times for my art shows, I do self-portraits, and to make sure that every student's successful, I actually have them work right on top of a photograph of themselves. So that way they have that gradient. It's usually a black and white photo, so they have kind of those gradients of gray. But then when we add color on top of it, it kind of changes some of those tints and shades once they add that color. So we talked about using patterns within each one of those squares, and then picking a color scheme. So I think I said either do warm on the background and cool on your face, or do warm on your face and cool in the background. And then I gave them, they could do whatever they wanted for the hair and the clothing. So kind of a neat way to teach Chuck Close at a real young age. A lot of times it's kind of hard for third graders to do that gridded technique. Kind of the same concept was working on top of a photograph right here. Once again, a black and white photograph that they've then used watercolor on top of, and how that pulls those different grays through the paints. This was inspired by Eduardo Cobra, who oftentimes takes very iconic photographs and then does almost like this kaleidoscopic colored effect on top of it. And then a lot of times he'll do like a sunburst behind it. He does have the world record for having the largest mural in the entire world that he did for the I think it was the Olympics, either the Olympics or the World Cup. But that was when they had it down in Brazil. So he made a huge mural based on that. So my students kind of did the same thing, gridded it out, and then we added some really bright, funky colors to their grid. Retina and Elmac, now they are two separate artists that oftentimes collaborate together. Retina is the artist who makes the symbols in the background. He's come up with his own language using these symbols. And then a lot of times he'll collaborate with Elmac, who will do portraits of people who live in the community that he's working. And a lot of times you can tell Elmac's style or his work, excuse me, because he has, you can see like the strokes of the spray paint. It almost takes on like this texture when he paints because of the way he applies the spray paint. So my students, I posed some questions to them and they had to come up with a symbol for each one of those things. Like if they like to read as a hobby, maybe their symbol would be a book. So they filled out the background using symbols that they created that represented things about themselves. And then I had them come up with a variety of different mark making that they could use, choose one, and then repeat that all the way across the self-portrait that they had drawn, and then use monochromatic colors to fill that in. Because a lot of times Elmac's work is monochromatic. We also talked a lot about facial proportions, making sure that things belong where they're supposed to on the face. And that's the way I start every school year with my third graders. We always start with a self-portrait project because I think it shows a lot of growth after I kind of walk them through how facial proportions actually look and work. Wayne Thiebaud, a lot of us are very familiar with his work and his sweet treats. So what my students did is we actually made a pinch pot for the base of this. And then they used coils to create the top to this cupcake or ice cream, depending on which one they wanted it to be. Then they could add little details or sprinkles or something to the outside of it. And lastly, we painted it and then put Mod Podge on it. I usually like to paint and use Mod Podge rather than use glaze because I think that they have more control over the paint than they do the glaze. A lot of times too, I'll do kind of these more advanced clay projects at the end of the year with third grade. And at that point, they should know how to do all these different things and how to mix the colors that they want with paint. So this is really like a capstone for them that they can apply all the knowledge from their 4 years with me into creating this, how to make pinch pots, how to do the coil pot, how to mix the colors that they need for their painting. And then the Mod Podge helps give it that kind of shiny sheen that a glaze would. Kusama is the princess of polka dots. She is known as putting polka dots on everything, particularly her pumpkins. And we take a look and students realize that by shifting or changing the size of her polka dots, she can make that pumpkin look three-dimensional, even though it's a flat 2D painting. So that's one thing we discuss is changing the variety of our polka dot sizes to make that pumpkin look a little bit more three-dimensional. And then one year we actually did make a 3D pumpkin just by making like a star shape out of some strips of paper, adding polka dots, and then they added a little stem at the top. And when we folded up all those 5 strips at the top and stapled it, it took on this three-dimensional shape. Sarah Morris is a painter, and she actually makes her paintings inspired by origami instructions. So this painting on the left, if you knew the instructions to folding that, it would actually create something. I'm not exactly sure what, but my students took a sheet of paper and they just began to fold it. So it made all these creases. And then we taped off those creases, and then they practiced creating tints and shades with the color and filling those in. So just kind of a study on value and tints and shades and mixing their own colors. For second grade, so that was all third grade stuff. Second grade, right around Halloween, I like to focus on Tim Burton, and we really look at like his style of art, which is German Expressionism. How a lot of times things are at weird angles, a lot of things are crooked, and how this creates kind of like an unnerving effect within his movies and stop motions. So I kind of teach them how to create a haunted house. We put that on top of a value background. So I teach them how to do tints and shades in the background to create a sense of space within their work. And we finish it off by adding some yellow windows, and we can add any other little details that they want, like a black cat or bats or spiders or gravestones. And this is probably one of their favorite projects that they do all year.
So fun. we have 10 minutes. There are a couple questions. I'm going to quick ask two, and then I'm going to have you continue because I know everybody's loving it. One was, what was the name of the Netflix show?
It's called The Art of Design. I believe that there's 2 seasons of it on there. And I think Olafur Eliason's in the second one. But there are some other really great artists on there too. I know my wife has used, there's a shoe design, Nike shoe designer on there that she's used at the high school level with students. Yeah, there are a lot of really amazing artists that they end up covering in it.
Thank you. I thought it was The Art of Design, but I wasn't sure if it was, his name was specifically attached to the whole thing or just an episode. So
No,
it's a whole series.
Yeah.
And then how about Chromebooks? Will some of these apps work in Chromebooks, do you know?
So I don't have Chromebooks. All my students are one-to-one iPads, but I believe the Drawings app, so the one where they could create the radial designs, I believe that has a website that you could use on Chromebooks. I think that Assembly might also have a web one too, but like I said, Assembly has a subscription fee attached to it now, so I don't know if you could use that one unless you pay for it. Those are the only ones I can think of off the top of my head. I know a lot of people have been doing things with Google Draw recently. I've not experimented with that, but I know that that's an app that's become very popular with the art teachers recently.
Very cool. I know that there's a Facebook group that is online art teachers. That might be a great place to ask about that as well. So give us one more, maybe 2 more, and then we're probably going to have to close up. But keep going. I'll only interrupt when it's right down to the wire.
All right, sounds good. So Bridget Riley, she is an op artist, and my kids love learning about Bridget Riley. They think it's so cool that art can be an optical illusion. They've always seen them before, but they've never really thought about them like that. A lot of times her work is done just in black and white. But she does have a few that are colored, but we work just in black and white. And my students make an optical illusion weaving. So instead of cutting the straight lines on the warp that you cut into, I think it's the warp, I have them cut a variety of lines. So they might do zigzags or curvy lines. And then we weave just black strips into that. So it creates this checkerboard pattern. Sometimes I'll just leave those weavings as is. Other times we'll take a sheet of paper and cut something out of it, and then we'll glue that on top so that the negative space of that black sheet of paper shows the weaving that they did. Another cool thing to tie in with op art is something called razzle dazzle camouflage. This is something that they used back in World War I and II, where they actually brought in op artists to paint battleships. And this was inspired by animals from nature, because a lot of times animals don't try to necessarily camouflage themselves from things. They try to oftentimes confuse predators with the markings. So what these op artists would do is they would create all these funky optical illusions on these ships. And the goal wasn't to hide the ship from the enemy. The goal was to confuse the enemy. You couldn't tell if the ship was moving forward or backward or whether it was even moving at all. It could have just been sitting there. But because of those optical illusions, it really played tricks on the enemy's eyes. So that was something used back in World War I and II, and that was called razzle dazzle camouflage. Invader, he's a great one. My kids really like learning about him. He is a street artist who uses simple bathroom tiles to create mosaics. And then he puts them up around cities, and he won't just go to a city and do like 1 or 2 of his little invader murals. He'll go to a city and he'll put up like 30 of them. He calls them an invasion. So he really goes all over the city putting these up. And obviously he gets his inspiration from the old 1980s video game Space Invader. And my kids really enjoy that because obviously it's a video game. They love video games. It also reminds them of Minecraft, which always cracks me up because they asked if this was inspired by Minecraft. I tell them this came out way before Minecraft was ever thought of. But this was a great lesson from Don Massey where I gave each of my students a 7 by 7 inch clay tile. And then we use Legos to print in a symmetrical invader character that they created. And we talk about contrast and coloring and painting in that clay tile when it was finished. So we colored the invader character with crayon, and then we used temper cakes to paint on top of that. I highly recommend having a clay roller, a slab roller, if you're going to do this. I did not, and I hand threw like 100 of these 7x7-inch clay tiles, and it was nuts. I looked like The Rock by the time I was done with it, from wedging and throwing all that clay. But if you have a slab roller, it's be much easier. Another invader project that I've done is like just die cutting a bunch of squares and having students create an invader character just using pre-cut paper squares. And then I've also done it in Google Sheets, where I gave them like an 8x8 spreadsheet, and then they could go in and fill in the spreadsheet cells with colors and create characters that way too. Damien Hirst, another one of those love him or hate him artists. He's most famous for putting dead animals in formaldehyde and how these animals then last for a really long time. But what we focus on are his spin paintings that he does. Back in the 90s, he actually went to a fair dressed up as a clown, and people paid him to make spin paintings. And then when they were done, he would autograph their painting and they'd be on their way. A lot of these people didn't realize that they were walking off with the painting that Damien Hirst had just autographed, because he was disguised as a clown. A lot of times he'll take those paintings then too and cut them into different shapes like skulls or butterflies. So my students start off second grade learning about butterflies and all the different forms they go through. So we actually do spin paintings, but we take a paper plate and we use the primary colors to paint on that paper plate, and they flip it upside down on a white sheet of paper and begin to rotate it with their hand. And these primary colors then begin to spin and to mix, and you start to get secondary colors. So this is a great one at the beginning of the year, because my kids know that to mix the primary colors, you get secondaries. They've done that 100 times up to that point. So this is just a kind of a new, unique way for them to practice mixing those colors, refreshing their memory, without just doing it with a paintbrush, that they can actually spin these plates and see the colors kind of smear and mix together. Once they've got their spin paintings done, then the next class, I teach them how to fold their paper in half and then draw half of a butterfly. And when they cut it out, then they have the whole butterfly. And then we finish it off by painting on the butterfly, and then they fold it and how that translates itself over to the other side of the butterfly. So kind of focusing on that symmetry as well as the primary colors mixing to make the secondaries.
So good. And we are down to the last 2.5 minutes, and I hate to have you stop. The great news is now's the time to download the handout. So it's in the either the right or the left of your screen, and it's under handouts. Just click on it and download it. If anybody has any problems, please email me, kbakke@nascoeducation.com, or respond to the follow-up email. Devon, you have no idea how many people were like, this is so great, thank you so much. So lots of great compliments on giving so many ideas and being so free to share them. Thank you so much. You never cease to amaze me. You are so good at what you do. And I just am going to tell everybody, Devon is now also teaching PE and music during this pandemic. So like, this guy is the real deal. So thank you for being essential in the art education world. Don't ever leave us. Next week, we are going to introduce again, we did it once a week ago, but we're going to reintroduce the art class curator curriculum that we have. If you came to the first one, feel free to come to this one too, because we're going to do it a little bit differently, a little bit more conversationally, and have some other parts to talk about. So it'll be definitely interesting. That is next week. And then we have a great lineup after that. We've got some really good stuff. I can't tell you because I got to have it all signed, sealed, and delivered, but please keep coming back. Please keep staying safe, be happy, and keep teaching art.
Thanks, Kris.
Thank you.